Welcome, everybody. We are live here in front of the Supreme Court. To my left here and to my right, we have Congress. So my name is Brandy Douglas. My pronouns are she and they, and I am the Senior Communications Associate with NDN Collective. Today, we just unrolled our position paper, Roe v. Wade through an Indigenous lens, and how consent, body sovereignty, and self-determination are the real conversation. I'm here with Steph Vieira. Steph, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Steph Vieira. Yat Bene. I use they, them pronouns. I'm Diné and Salvadorian, based out of Los Angeles, California, but today we're in D.C., right in front of the Supreme Court to talk about and expand on the LGBT and queer perspective and two-spirit perspective of the body sovereignty paper that we just released this morning. Brandy, do you want to kick us off with just a little bit about what the paper, our section of the paper, is about?
Definitely. Thanks, Steph. You know, Steph, I just want to credit you as being a catalyst for ensuring that our LGBTQIA two-spirit community was included in this paper. I know that a portion of the paper actually talks about how our community is overlooked in this discussion, which is a critical component. And still to this day, if we're reading a lot about this decision and its impacts, we're seeing that community left out. And so I know that this section of the paper, and we welcome you all to take a look at the paper. We have it live at our website, www.indiancollective.org. Talks a lot about the historical trauma and violence to our community. And I know that when we don't talk about these issues and include them, that's a continuation of this violence. And so, Steph, I know that we were talking this morning about some current issues that are kind of a continuation of that violence, and I'm not sure if you wanted to touch on those. I know we talked about the Kamloops powwow and how that exclusion and direct violence to our community in terms of regulations for their powwow and the exclusion of gender diverse people was also an issue that's related to this paper. So I'm not sure if you want to expand on that.
Sure, I'll expand on it a little bit. So last week, I'm not sure if any of you heard or many of you have, that the Kamloops powwow based in so-called Canada released their regulations for opportunities to dance in a powwow, but also a number of colonial tactics and ways of thinking of excluding gender diverse Indigenous folks, our two-spirit folks, to be able to dance and fully express their identities in a space that we would all imagine we'd like to be included in and feel like we belong. And so that regulation list really listed, that there wasn't going to be an acceptance of what they normally would call cross dancing or switch dancing, but also included, colonial violence tactics of reporting, the level of Indian blood that you carry, and also, just really, really violent ways of thinking in this time, and I don't think that that's part of what Indigenous people should be carrying with them at this time. I think it's really important to remember that queer Indigenous folks and two-spirit folks were widely accepted since time immemorial in many tribal nations, and two-spirit is sort of like an umbrella term that was fostered in the 90s in northern Canada, but trickled down back to activate the presence of all queer Indigenous people throughout Turtle Island and below the so-called colonial border of Mexico. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that, we've belonged here since forever. And I think that we still are here. And I think the presence of us being here needs to be revitalized in respect. And so I think that's like a really important aspect of the paper, to show that we're not going anywhere, and we're going to be very, very activated at this time. We're not supposed to be left out of the conversation, and I think when we talk about body sovereignty, when we talk about protecting the right to choose, we need to include, trans men. We need to include Two-Spirit folks in that affirmative care, because the right to choose, the right to an abortion, is protecting gender affirmation, right? And so that's basically what we're demanding for Indian country, but also these legislators, these congressionals, to acknowledge and diversify in their language, but also to accept and acknowledge the community.
Absolutely. And, right now I believe there's about 300 plus pieces of legislation across the nation that is anti-LGBTQ. And so this is just another issue, and we definitely want this to trickle down to our tribal communities and governments to ensure that our queer folks, our non-binary folks, anyone under the LGBTQIA umbrella are protected. And I know that's a conversation that hasn't started in a lot of communities. It needs to start. If it was left off in any communities, we need to revisit those things, because colonial law is not the thing that's going to protect us in the long run. I think it's a lot about remembering where we came from, remembering the sacredness of these community members, and it's just about remembering and kind of unraveling what we've been entangled in terms of colonial law, and relying on those mechanisms. And so I know that in the Navajo Nation, you had discussed some issues in terms of acknowledging the right to marry. And so I'm not sure if you wanted to expand on that anymore.
Yeah, so I think first I want to acknowledge, Navajo Nation Pride, and really all of those members of facilitating the celebration of queer Indigenous folks, but also, the work that they do to advocate for our rights on the Navajo Nation. But also, I really want to emphasize, right now there's an election going on for the next Navajo Nation president. And I really want to emphasize for those leaders who are, who consider themselves a strong ally to the LGBT community, to remember that, those Diné youth really rely on their safety. They really don't. I really don't think it's a matter of they should not have to think about whether or not they're going to be safe on their own homelands. They should most worry about their education and their well-being, and the connection to the culture. And I think the lack of representation, or the lack of respect that the Diné youth might see is during these times, I think it's really dire that the next Navajo Nation leaders honor the right to marry. That's someone's daydream, to be able to be with their partners for a long time, right? And some feel it necessary to have those ceremonial marriages, to have those traditional tying of the knot. And I think it's really important to be able to see that their community will accept them, to see that they can have that in their future. And so in order to have that dream, in order to have that reality, I think that it's up to our cishet counterparts to be able to show that we're going to solidify this, and we're not going to mimic, the U.S. government. We're not going to mimic those colonial tactics of violence onto us. And I think we need to, as Indigenous people, reclaim that power and say, hey, no, we're a sovereign nation. We need to be able to act accordingly to that.
Yes, definitely. And that's a critical decision for tribal communities and governments and nations to make, because with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there's other things at stake here. The right to marriage overall for LGBTQIA plus folks is at stake. And, if we lose that, we have to rely on our governments to honor those sacred unions. And so we have to ensure that we keep this dialogue up. We keep talking about it. After today, maybe you're just being introduced to the LGBTQIA Two-Spirit community being impacted by this. But the critical thing is to keep these discussions up, to remain in community with folks, and to continue advocating for your relatives, because we're all relatives.
Right. I think you said that best. We're all relatives, and we all need to be kind to one another. And sometimes that kindness is doing what you can. with your right to vote, with your right to advocate for one another. And I think that it's just the most important thing to be a good relative, and what that means is acknowledging, one another's pronouns. That's a great first step, is, stating your pronouns in a space where that there's two-spirit people, where that there's queer, Indigenous relatives present, and also, respecting folks by the way that they choose to identify and the way that they are. I think it's really important, in the spaces that I've been in, to feel accepted, and then eventually that fostering into community and belonging.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because in the end, community care is essential for all of our members, but especially the LGBTQIA2 spirit community who are feeling overshadowed in this moment. And I know that we need to step up as queer community members, but allies in supporting this community. So I know that, we'd love for all of you to check out this position paper that just came out. It's on our website. We'll try and drop it into the chat at some point. But this is a critical piece to understanding all the layers of this issue, and we invite all of you to take a look at it. And we're just so happy that you're tuning in today.
Yeah. Thanks, Brandy, for reminding our folks that the position paper on body sovereignty, the effects of Roe v. Wade from an Indigenous lens, is live on our website, and also available on all social media accounts, our Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, our LinkedIn. I think I forgot to mention I'm the current social media manager, so all of that stuff is live. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat below. And also, if you have any resources for, queer Indigenous relatives, be sure to drop those as well on socials. We love to hear about, new bodies of work that Indigenous people are carrying, but also safe spaces for those that need it.
Thank you, and we thank all of you for tuning in. We need to do this together and rally together to ensure that all of our relatives are protected.